connect. I have connections with the left in Buffalo that go way back to my early childhood. Good family friends, George and Wilma Eggers. He taught at SUNY. She taught at Canisius, I'm pretty sure. Were old family friends from childhood, and also like Mark Dudzik, my close comrade, brother, friend, is a Buffalo native. And I spent a little bit of time in Buffalo myself at Empire State College about 20 years ago, and colleagues very graciously took me across the border to see the Hummingbird Museum, which was quite exciting. But anyway, like I'm really, well, I wouldn't say impressed, but I think the work that you guys are doing is so very important now, especially as we're facing what's coming down the road at us. So I'm just sorry I couldn't be there live, but I'm happy to be part of this event.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we greatly appreciate it. I was going to open up with the first question if you're ready.
Sure.
All right. So Buffalo faced a mass shooting this weekend just down the street at a grocery store by an explicitly stated white supremacist who believes in the Great Replacement theory. 10 were killed and more were injured. The targeting of the store was made possible by in-practice segregation in our city. Your latest book explores the experiences in local politics between the codified segregation of Jim Crow in the South and the often de facto segregation scene in the North. How do you think Buffalo, which is among the top 10 segregated cities in the US, could compare with your experiences? And do you think class politics can overcome segregation and course correct against right-wing radicalization?
Well, those are really important questions. Let me say first that so back in the 90s, when I was doing a lot of traveling, right, with the Labor Party, and often enough, it seemed like I would get on a plane in the city that had the highest homicide rate in the country, and I'd get off the same plane in a different city that had the highest homicide rate in the country. Now that's partly because I did a lot of traveling between DC, Baltimore, and Chicago, and Detroit and New Orleans. But the point is that the segregation rates are kind of like that also, right? It's kind of hard to, well, it seems like everybody is among the top 10 most segregated cities in the country. And actually, my son and I were talking about this this morning, because he grew up partly in Atlanta and partly in New Haven, Connecticut. And he was recalling that an acquaintance of his who had gone to graduate school in New Haven mentioned something to him about New Haven having been sharply segregated. And he was curious because he didn't recall it as quite that way. And the reason he didn't recall it as quite that way is that the racial dimension and the class dimension of residential segmentation get mushed together often enough, right? And what was the case in New Haven in the 80s was that there were a lot of broke Black people and broke Puerto Ricans and enough broke white people. And I think that a lot of times what looks like racial segregation as an abstraction is itself also like the product of capitalists sorting out residential segmentation on the basis of the criteria of real estate valuation. That said, Buffalo certainly has its own history of segregation. The thing I didn't mention about my past with Buffalo is I read a fair amount about the Klan's operations in Buffalo earlier in the 20th century. But the thing is, I guess the answer to the action question is that, yes, I don't think there's any kind of politics other than a working class based politics that can overcome segregation understood as residential segmentation, because what drives the segregation is ultimately the work of the real estate industry in assigning different values to different parcels of land within the metropolitan area. That's what the real estate industry does. That's why they're there. And fair market value, we've all come to to experience that like it's nature, right? But it's not, right? Like it's a product of Will's decision by private real estate interests in collusion with with government, right? That's the only way to think of what people now refer to as a gentrification, right? It's a work of market forces that is subsidized by government that push resources in some directions and away from others. It's in some, there's no question, but that race can be at minimum, right, a shorthand for who deserves to get what my son calls the fuzzy end of the lollipop, or whom you can get away with screwing over because they don't have the political clout and power to do anything about it. But again, what fundamentally drives segregation is markets and market forces that are supported by government. And I'll just say one more thing about the shooting, because I want to make this clear. Like the kid who did it clearly is a racist. There's no question about that. To whatever extent it makes sense that a lost loner, an 18-year-old can be clearly anything. Like Dylan Roof, right? And in a different way, Kyle Rittenhouse, right? The deeper problem here isn't whether or not this Gendron, or whatever this kid's name is, read the protocols of the Elders of Zion or picked up like replacement theory or whatever. The fundamental problem is that nobody ever wants to address, like in any of these shootings, is like the combination of, young people who fall through the cracks, and that happens, right? Like in any society, but also all these damn guns that are on the street, right? Like if he didn't have access to guns, then he would be a sick proto-racist loner, right, out there. So I know, I apologize for the response, because it's what my grandmother would have called going all around Robin Hood's barn to answer a question. But I hope it's borderline adequate as a response anyway.
No, thank you. I think that hit all the points.
Yeah, for people who aren't familiar with your work, I was wondering if you could tie this back and you could explain what your new book, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, covers.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll give it a shot. I mean, thanks for asking. As you may have noticed, I refrained from calling it a memoir, and because I don't think of it as that. The book originates from discussions that a couple of good friends of mine and I had in the waning years of the last century about the reality that when our general cohort, one of these friends is like a few years older, the other one's a few years younger. But our musings were such, and all three of us have like deep roots in the Deep South. And our musings basically went to the circumstance that when our cohort sort of leaves the stage of history, there won't be anyone left around anymore with any direct connection to what the Jim Crow regime was like as everyday life and lived experience. And what I don't say any place in the book, but what I have admitted, so I'll admit it here too, is that what prompted our discussions was our dissatisfaction with the state of writing about the era, right? Both the scholarly writing and the commentary and the actual memoir stuff. And partly a dissatisfaction had to do with the circumstance, and this makes sense, right? Like the power of the heroic narrative on one side of the coin of the period or the 2 decades of intense civil rights insurgency after World War II. And on the other side of the coin, the horror of the brutality and the out and out racism, right? And commitment to white supremacy that the insurgency was arrayed against, kind of swept people up, even scholars who write very carefully about the period. And they tend to get lost have tended to get lost in the big story, right? It's almost like Holocaust. On the other hand, commentators tend to err in the other direction, and it's all like sort of worm's eye view, or what it was like for me growing up. So what I set out to do, and I've started writing this with no particular end in mind about 2002, 2003, was to sort of lay out an account of what the Jim Crow order was like as a social order. That is, not just as a set of bad practices, like separate takeout windows and separate water fountains, but the deep structures rooted in political economy from which that social order originated, the threats that it was a response to, and how it was reproduced, and also the forces that eventually began to erode it both from within and from without. But I also wanted to get across that it was a social order that was imposed, not simply that white people as an abstraction imposed on Black people, but it was a regime that some white people imposed on everybody else, both Black and white, and that it was always fundamentally in service to a class program, which is not, in case anybody starts to freak out, which is not in any way to say that Jim Crow wasn't about racism and white supremacy. Of course it was. Like, I mean, it says that on his calling card, right? Like on the introduction. But that's not the entire story. So that's what I wanted to do in the book. And I initially, I don't know, like I wrote my way into that no person's land of around 15,000 words. Is too long for an article and too short for a book. And it sat in my computer for a long time. And then thankfully, a couple of friends and colleagues who read it and pushed me to try to get it published and made some concrete suggestions about how to expand it. Helped me finish it a couple of years ago, and Verso liked it, and so here we are.
Yeah, and something interesting just about Buffalo, of course, in terms of like that history, is that the Black population that came to Buffalo was in the second migration in the 40s to 70s, which was the era of the civil rights movement, and the afterlives of that for even in the North was still a very codified segregation that is clear on a map, but hard to understand with any city if you don't look at the dynamic political and economic forces here.
Right.
I want to expand on that. And also in what Connor brought up in our first question. So he referenced class politics. This is something that you reference in your work. A thread that runs through your work is an objection to identity politics, because this reductionism papers over important class divisions. And for example, you often discuss Black politics. The objection isn't based on oppression not existing, clearly from your personal experiences growing up, clearly from everything that we see every day. It's the political function, right? That this politics has empowered a brokerage model in which a single ambitious representative claims to express the unified interests of any constituency here: women, LGBTQ people, Black people, Hispanic people, etc. Despite there being significantly different relationships to capital, that is to say class, in any of these demographics, any demographic that could exist. So in the last few decades, how has your critique and this brokerage model alongside it evolved?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, if anything, I'll start out like this. Like I, came into politics on the left, and I came into politics on the left in the context of the Black Power movement, right? And that's where my main associations were when I was in North Carolina as a youngster. I mean, just for perspective, I had just turned 19 when Stokely Carmichael shouted Black Power on the Meredith March, right? And I was part of the group that took over the campus NAACP chapter at my college and rechristened it the Black Student Movement. And after I left college, after a cafeteria strike. I spent several years like as an organizer out in Eastern North Carolina, principally, and with poor people's organizations and in the GI anti-war movement. And then spent a couple of years working in the agency that had hired the organizers, basically, before I went to graduate school. In 1972, out of a sense that the left in Black politics had already been outflanked and defeated, right? So that's in 1972 already. But it took several years, I mean, of my trying to figure out how to construct a proper class politics. And by proper, I mean an effective and a clear-headed class politics in the context of Black power radicalism. And I finally determined that one of the reasons that we failed, and there were several, right? I mean, not the least of which is that the other side, the mainstream politicians had access to resources that radicals didn't. And as I'm sure, right, all of your members know, nothing builds a movement better than resources. But also, like, the radicals couldn't get beyond a critical understanding that posited something called the Black community as the source of radical political agency, right? So, and what I mean by that is that the critiques that our side generated of the Black bourgeois politicians and the mainstream Black elites and whatever else was that they didn't genuinely represent the interests of the Black community. And the problem with that was that there is no Black community, right? The Black community is a fiction that has its roots back in Bookerite ideology. And for anybody who is interested in tracing that out, I would strongly suggest reading Michael Rudolph West's great book, The Education of Booker T. Washington, in which he argues that Washington substantively, not as a theorist, but that Washington was responsible for inventing the notion of race relations, which was an alternative at the beginning of the 20th century to dealing with the reality of Black Americans' citizenship right under the US Constitution. But anyway, because the Black community is this empty abstraction, the right-wing politicians and the business types could claim to represent it just as powerfully as we could. And since the Black community was that kind of abstraction, it couldn't speak on its own because it didn't exist. So it was in effect, a ventriloquist dummy for all the rest of us who were trying to speak for it, right? And it took me, I think, probably the better part of a decade after trying systematically to think through what the limitations of Black power radicalism were, to come to that point of view that the problem is, and if you can forgive me a shameless plug, but in the title of a collection of our work that Walter Ben Michaels and I are going to have coming out at the end of the summer, there's no politics but class politics ultimately. And I mean, and look, frankly, I think everything that's happened since 2016, when the Black chattering class went on a rampage against Bernie Sanders and has stayed on it since then, and has, and Joanne Reed is a common target for me just because I get so pissed off about her. But when she and others began after the 2016 election contending that references to a working class politics are nothing but attempts to sanitize white racism, it couldn't be any clearer, right? Because what that argument means, that claim means, it is that Black people can't be working class, Hispanic people can't be working class, right? That to be a working class, you got to be a racist white man. And that's convenient if you're trying to peddle a political program like that centers on, for instance, something called the racial wealth gap, which I stress every time I have the opportunity, really exists only between the richest 10% of Black people and the richest 10% of white people. That kind of tells you what that politics is. So as my son, Touré Reed, argues, I think very forcefully in his book, Toward Freedom, those people who denounce the likes of us as something called class reductionists, and I've never seen a class, I've hardly ever seen a class reductionist anywhere in my life, are in fact people who are projecting away from their own commitment to a race first and race only politics, which is itself also a class politics, but the politics of a different class from the working class.
Left of neoliberalism.
The left wing of neoliberalism, as you said.
The left wing of neoliberalism. Thank you very much.
I
Couldn't have said it better
you
myself.
Yeah, can you tell that we've read your work a lot? I have one last follow-up, and then I'm going to bring Joy up here to ask about a left labor coalition.
Yeah, okay.
So again, one more follow-up. There's a longstanding reference that you discuss a lot among the left to support and cast whatever issue is in vogue, whatever crisis is happening right now as revolutionary, without the test of persuasion on a socialist program to that constituency. Do these critiques that you've been making since the 90s still hold? And how do you think the class conscious left can get off the hamster wheel to become politically consequential? I know that's a leading question, but.
Oh man, yeah, that's a huge question. Yeah, well, and look, I mean, that's a question that faces us all. And I don't know if people who read me can pick it up, but I've certainly felt it. Like over the past several years, but especially since the lead up to the 2020 election, I've felt. I've been more and more concerned about the possibility of authoritarian, generically, or fascist, if you prefer, coup, putsch, takeover in the U.S. And what leads me to that, what led me to that concern, was that looking not just at the U.S. but around the globe. Between the Great Recession of 2008, 9, and like other tendencies, it just may be that we're approaching or have gotten to a point at which neoliberalism, left or right, is exhausting or has exhausted its capacities to deliver enough stuff to enough of the population to continue to legitimize its existence as a nominally democratic social order. So when that happens, there's really only two ways you can go. Like I've often invoked the metaphor of a T intersection, right? You get to a T intersection, you either go left or right, right? And it looks like in American politics now, and we aren't alone here, we either turn right toward authoritarianism of whatever stripe, and I don't have any time for the book leftists who want to debate based on 1928 and 1933 or whatever, what's genuinely fascist and what's not. I mean, my sense is that if the question comes up, then then that's evidence that it's not time to parse it anymore. It's time to fight it. But that's the right turn direction. The other direction, it seems to me, just has to be toward social democracy, right, of some sort or other. The question after Biden won the election and was inaugurated was whether, or the extent to which, Biden, Pelosi, Schumer, and that wing of the Democratic Party, that broad Clintonist wing of the Democratic Party, recognized, following, ironically, Brian Dees and BlackRock and the asset managers, right, that we've reached a point at which, for system preservation reasons, there's a need actually to do something, to deliver something concrete for working people. And that was an open question. It was an open question, through the fight over Build Back Better. I think the Progressive Caucus was to be commended for the way that they operated during the first couple of months of this year. I think they succeeded, for instance, in moving segments of the corporate news-infotainment industry, especially MSNBC, off the sort of standard line that the leftists or progressives are demanding too much, and they need to start acting like adults. I think they did a very good job of demonstrating that they were carrying the administration's water, first of all, and that the reality is that the danger posed by Trumpism should show that the Democrats have to deliver something concrete and palpable to working people, not more empty promises of the sort that we've seen since the mid-1980s with Clintonism, and I'll come back for you later, right once we take care of Wall Street. That was good, but see, here's where I think there's a big contradiction, right, or a problem. And I don't think Bernie Sanders was in any way responsible for this, but there's a fantasy, right, that we can elect our way out of class struggle, or we can win class struggle through electoral politics, right? Because I've thought for a long time, and this was certainly a view that we came together around in the Labor Party, that the electoral domain is fundamentally a place for institutionally consolidating victories that have won on the plane of social movement organizing, right? In the trade union sector and elsewhere, right? From building a mass movement. What happened with the Progressive Caucus was once Manchin and Sinema and whoever else decided to deviate from the rules of the game. And the Progressive Caucus was brilliant in the way that they operated within the rules of the game. Once they decided to deviate from the rules of the game by basically going outside the Beltway and advocating for the interests of their corporate constituencies, right? It would have been time for the Progressive Caucus to make the same move. And like, I'm kind of small-minded, so it always comes to my mind is like mobilizing 500,000 people to go occupy the 14th Street Bridge in DC and stop traffic like in and out of the district. Because the Progressive Caucus is fundamentally an electoralist body, it doesn't have that kind of constituency, didn't have the capacity but to generate that kind of movement. And I think that should be a lesson to all of us about the limits of electoralism, right? There is no such thing as a free lunch. Like, we're not going to defeat the fascists simply by electing John Fetterman. Although I hope to God's sake that Fetterman wins, and will do everything that I can, to help him win that race in November, to help the Democrats keep the Senate. But I don't know. So did I run off at the mouth again?
No, not at all.
Yeah, no, the limitations of the Progressive Caucus, as bold as they can be, even within the domains of power, they always have their hands tied behind their back. Yeah, Audrey, do you have a question?
Right.
Yeah.
We have 10 minutes.
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like that's kind of a good segue to talking about building up, right, working class movements and doing the actual nitty gritty work of politics in the streets before we try to get into electoralism. Like I'm a 10-year union member of the street metal workers, and now a officer in that union as well. And I've been trying to build a left-wing coalition within the organization to advocate for working class politics. And with that in mind, what paths do you see for socialists in the organizing surge we are living in the future of a labor left coalition?
Well, and that's another great question. I mean, so our work with Debs-Jones-Douglass is really like a continuation. Well, Debs-Jones-Douglass was created as the 501c3 cultural and educational arm of the Labor Party, like in the late 90s. And that's the work that we've been carrying on. And to wit, I mean, we have a podcast some of you may know about. I'd like everybody to know about it. That we call the Class Matters Podcast. And you can find us at classmatterspodcast.org on the DJDI website, Patreon, Spotify, YouTube, all the rest of that stuff. And we're starting to work on the 5th episode now. And our tagline for the podcast and for everything else that we've done is that we're the place where we want to discuss seriously what the country would look like if it were governed by and for the working class, right? And so we think it's, among other things, it's important for us to keep the conversation like at that level, right? I mean, to talk to workers, to operate within unions, as much as possible, but also like in the working class communities and other organizations. I mean, we, during the South Carolina primary in 2020, we had I'm a Medicare for All South Carolina voter campaign that was about doing public education around Medicare for all, while the issue was on the table right because of the presidential primary. And as a result of our work, like, more than 18,000 South Carolinians, mainly working class, mainly Black, signed pledge cards saying that they prefer not to vote for candidates who didn't support Medicare for all. But beyond that, once we started talking about healthcare and responses to the healthcare crisis, and by the way, like, we also affirm that you don't really need to have people telling stories about how they and their families have been chewed up and spat out by the healthcare system, because most working people have some version of that story, right? So like, they don't need to be convinced about it, right? But what does work or does have an effect is helping people see what the roots of what the sources of the crisis are, and offering credible alternatives, ways out of it that you can fight for. And one of the things that we learned is that once people started talking about healthcare, access to healthcare as a right, and recognizing the extent to which marketization is like the core problem in the healthcare system, then on their own, they start talking about other categories of life, right? Like housing and education, right? So, I mean, it's like we've got to be able to fight the battles that are here right in front of us, that are mainly going to be set by the other side, because the other side is in power now and controls the terms of debate, whether they're the ultra, the reactionaries on the other side, or the neoliberal Dems, or the neoliberal anti-racists who are part of the neoliberal Dems, or the neoliberal anti-sexists who are part of the neoliberal Dems. But at the same time, to kind of develop deep connections within the class, right, to do the kind of political education alongside the other work, right, that will help us build a movement that we need eventually. And let me just say one other thing, if you don't mind. Like, it's a little bit of a digression, but I don't think it's that much of one. Shortly after Alito's leaked opinion, I started to write a draft that I stopped, and I may come back to it later, but it just didn't seem to be especially helpful at this point. But a draft that kind of reflected on what's happened to the struggle for reproductive freedom since the mid-70s to when it became a woman's right to choose, right? And one thing that I drew attention to was, until well into the 80s, right? in the left wing of the women's movement, right, and more broadly, abortion rights, first of all, were tied to reproductive rights and reproductive freedom. They were tied to healthcare, right, the right to healthcare, but were also tied to a panoply like of other issues that were rooted in political economy, just as abortion rights and reproductive freedom should be rooted, first of all, in political economy, as well as healthcare. But a publicly funded program of child and elder care, right? People were considering stuff like how patterns of industrial location and patterns of residence shaped and limited women's right of access to employment opportunities, but also notions, and the Yale clerical and technical workers strike in 1984 was a big moment in this, but also discussions of comparable worth that went so far as to problematize the cultural and ideological component of notions of skill. That is going beyond equal pay for equal work, but to take into account the fact that skill is not simply determined, or skill levels aren't simply determined by market forces, but by cultural and ideological assumptions of who deserves to be paid what. So like this was all part of the genuinely radical potential of the feminist movement that wasn't that long ago, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm old, I can remember, right? Like my kid was in high school even, when these issues were still at play. And it's with the victory of Clintonite, proto-neoliberal, democratic tendency, and the triumph of a bourgeois notion of women's interest in politics. But I'm going back to Mo's observation about what about interest group stuff. So like women get condensed into this single issue that's not even reproductive freedom. It's not even really abortion rights. It's the right to choose, which is perfectly consistent with the neoliberal ideology. And in the same way that Blacks and Hispanics get kind of shoehorned into a combination of pro forma support for affirmative action and appointments of the first Black or Hispanic or Asian American or LGBTQ, whatever, right? And this is partly the politics that we have to try to overcome now to get our way out of, to be able to build a left that we need. And I'll just say, just to draw the sum line under it, I think we all should begin by acknowledging that there is no left in the US, right? There are leftists, obviously, like we're all among them, right? But as Mark Dudzik, Buffalonian by birth and by heart, and I argue, like in an article in the Socialist Register in 2015, by left, like we mean something pretty specific, right? That we mean like an organized force with some institutionalized clout that has the capacity to contest, to change, to alter the terms of political debate, right? To affect the wage structure in a given industry, to stop a redevelopment project in whatever city you're in. And we've shown that we don't have that, right? And that's not, it shouldn't be embarrassing, right? Like it's a first order of business. We don't have it, we need it. And but I think one of the things that admitting that there is no left can do for us is it can take the pressure off of feeling like you gotta make statements about every goddamn thing that happens in the world, right? Right. I mean, we don't have to make a statement about the war in Ukraine, as horrible as it is, because there's nothing we can do about it. And our statement's not going to affect anything. It's not like the Bush administration, much less Putin or the Jerry Lewis, who was elected president of Ukraine, is waiting for statements from the American left to determine what their strategy is going to be. So the thing for us to do is like, if we start out from understanding our abject weakness, then I think it should make it easier for us to keep our heads down and focused on the work that we need to do to become, I don't know, less weak. I'm done.
Thank you so much. I think we've really learned a lot from this and from reading your work over the last couple terms of this particular steering committee. The last question we have, you actually brought up the Class Matters podcast. The last question I think we have for you is, what do you envision is a society that's planned and operated by the working class?
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I tell you what, you guys had warned me you were going to ask this. And it feels like I should have some kind of response because we put all our guests on the podcast on the spot, but that meant to respond to this question. And what's sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander. Well, the simplest of the response would be that that it would be a society in which the number one test for every policy proposal or initiative is what does it do for working people versus what does it do to working people, right? To take one instance, right, just one area, privatization, right? I think like an end to privatization would be one goal, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm not smart enough or visionary enough to have a sense about what a properly functioning socialist society would look like. I think ultimately we'll kind of make it as we strive for it. And I know that may sound like a cop-out, but it's the best I got.
It's a tough question. Yeah.
No, thank you for asking it though. I deserve it. And I'll be more humble next time I ask it on the podcast. Although we do it like by policy area, right? So what a working class K through 12 education system would look like, for instance. But
a lot of layers to it for sure.
But I mean, but these are the questions that we ought to be talking about among ourselves and among workers, right? So that's great.
We gotta go and start convention, but I just wanted to say thank you so much. Dr. Reed can't see you guys, so like if we could clap and just say thank you.
Oh.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much for having me and have a great convention. And we'll be in touch, I hope.
Yes, yeah, we will. All right.
Okay. Take care.
People who are staying on, there's another Zoom link for our actual convention so you can vote and watch in. And yeah, see you on the other Zoom link. It's on the Action Network and the Buffalo DSA calendar.